Amen. Amen. Okay, got your Bibles. Genesis chapter 18 is where we have gotten to. We are doing a study through the Old Testament. We are not rushing, but we're not spending too much time on every little chapter. We've been in this series now for, a couple of months, something like that. We've gotten to Genesis 18. We talked about how we're spending more time in Genesis probably than any other book we'll spend in, just because it's so foundational. There's a lot there. It's very deep with a lot of stuff, and so we've been taking our time in Genesis. There are probably more, if you had the 10 most important chapters in the Bible, probably most of them, or at least the book that is represented the most would be the book of Genesis. So we're not rushing there. We won't rush through Exodus, but we will move quicker as we get later into the books. We are following the storyline of the Old Testament, and one of the main things we've been talking about is looking for what we've called the crimson threads, which is taken from a quote from D.A. Carson, one of the best Bible scholars alive, who says that there are crimson threads running from Genesis to Revelation that all lead to the cross, and that if you read the Old Testament without the knowledge of Jesus and thinking about Christ, then you will miss a lot of the beauty. And so we've been looking for those as we go, and we'll see some more of those tonight. Genesis 18 is where we get our first definite, what we call a Christophany, which is Jesus before he is in the flesh, pre-incarnate Jesus, seems to be appearing here in some sense in visible form. And this is with Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah and those things. And that's called a Christophany. So the general understanding is that this indeed is Christ along with two angels. Look at chapter 18, starting in verse 1. It says, "And the Lord," and you guys know this probably, but whenever those letters are all capitalized, that's the Hebrew word Yahweh, talking about God. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, "O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So, very odd kind of thing. We see angels coming in the flesh in the first time. We see in some way the Lord in the flesh for the first time. Abram sees them, knows in some sense they deserve to be worshipped, rushes out to them, brings them food and water, and they rest and eat and drink there with Abraham. And then the key part of chapter 18 is down in verse 10, where they say, "The Lord said, I will surely return to you." This is the one identified as Yahweh. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." Now, if you've been with us through this series in Genesis, you realize that when you're reading this book for the first time, that's what we've been looking forward to for a long time. And a lot of years have passed in Abraham's life. 30 or so years have passed in Abraham's life while he keeps waiting on the promise to be fulfilled, right? God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son, their own son of the flesh. And it hadn't happened yet. And it hadn't just been 6 months or a year or 2 years. It had been 5 years and then 10 years and then 20 years and then 30 years. That's like my whole life that they're waiting on this promise to be fulfilled. And so naturally, they're starting to doubt some things. Maybe God didn't mean it like that. Maybe it was a metaphor. Maybe it was an allegory. Maybe he meant something else. And then finally, we come to the place where God comes to Abraham and says, 1 year. No longer 5 years, 10 years. Next year, I will come to you and Sarah will be with child. She will be with you, I have promised you. And then later in chapter 18, we have that famous sort of conversation with Abraham and God about Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? We know that Lot and his family have gone and settled in Sodom. And now God's anger has been kindled because of Sodom's unrighteousness, which we'll look at again in a second. And so Abraham has this conversation with God where God lets Abraham know what's about to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, "God, you are holy and righteous. Would you wipe away the righteous with the wicked? You wouldn't do that." And Abraham said, if there's 45 righteous people in all of Sodom and Gomorrah, massive cities, by the way, we know that now archaeologically, massive cities, some of the biggest cities of antiquity. If there's 45 righteous people, would you save Sodom and Gomorrah? And God says, if there's 45, I would spare it. And Abraham says, give me this mercy. I'm just a man. Let me speak again. What if there's 40? Maybe if there's 40 people instead of 45. And then it's, okay, what if there's 30 people? And then it's, well, what if there's 20 people? And he gets all the way down and says, okay, well, what if there's 10 righteous people, which is just a few more than Lot and his family? What if there's 10 righteous people? And God says, if there's 10 righteous people, then I will spare them. If there's 10 righteous people in Sodom, then I will spare them. Now, here's one of those crimson threads a bit, where we can read that sort of interchange and ask, what is it that would have saved Sodom? What is it that would have saved Gomorrah? What is it that's being asked for over and over by Abraham? He's saying if there was 45, 40, 30, 20, 10 righteous people. What if there were just a few righteous people? The difference in them being destroyed and being saved was whether or not they were righteous. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6 says, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. The reality of what's coming at the end of Revelation, at the end of time, is the same thing that happened to Sodom and Gomorrah for exactly the same reason. Sodom and Gomorrah were wiped out because they were unrighteous. If they would have been righteous, they wouldn't have been wiped out. Even a small part righteous, even 10 out of tens of thousands righteous. If they would have had any righteousness, they would have been spared. But because they were unrighteous, fire and what's the word I'm looking for? Fire and sulfur rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's the same language used in Revelation about what's going to happen on the last day. That they will be thrown into the lake of fire, in the lake of sulfur. Same sort of idea of God's judgment against the unrighteous. And so the story that we looked at last week with Genesis 15, or 2 weeks ago, whenever that was, that we looked at in that week, is that what is necessary to be spared God's righteous judgment is righteousness. And that righteousness comes only by the way of Christ. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God. You will be spared on Judgment Day from fire and sulfur because God has granted you righteousness that He did not grant to Sodom. Because of your faithfulness despite their evil, God will not destroy the righteous. That's His promise here. He says over and over, I will not destroy the righteous. I will not destroy the righteous. I will not destroy the righteous. And the rest of the Bible is telling us how God is making you righteous, and therefore He will not destroy you. And then God knows who the righteous are in that city. There's only a few. Lot and his family are the righteous ones. And so He goes to get them out of Sodom. He goes to get them out of danger. Genesis 19, verse 1. Moving on to chapter 19. It says, the two angels, so the Lord one is gone, and the two angels that were there came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth. So these two angels come to get come to get Lot because Lot was righteous, and the righteous don't inherit judgment. So they come to save the righteous from the judgment. There's a connection here between this and the Hebrews passage in Hebrews 12 where it says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers because some have entertained angels unaware. I told you that. I think I did that in college maybe. That's another story. But that's a wild thing to think about, that entertain strangers because some have entertained angels unaware. And here we have angels who appear like men, at least in some sense, coming to Lot into his home, and he welcomes them in. These angels go to get Lot. Abram never asked God to go get Lot. God just does it. And this is the last chapter in which we ever hear of Lot. Now, Lot isn't the picture of righteousness, right? He isn't perfect by any means. He deliberately made a home for his family in Sodom. That wasn't wise, right? Makes a home for his family in a place that we're about to see how evil it actually is. The level of depravity they've come to. Lot makes his home there. You know from this story, when the angels come into the home, Lot sends his daughters out to the men who are groping at the door. Maybe because he knew that they wouldn't have been interested in them, which apparently they weren't. But either way, it was not good. It was not a good response to not handle it well. We get back to that description versus prescription thing, where just because the Bible tells us that's what happened, is not the Bible and not God giving us a thumbs up saying it's a good thing. Obviously, his wife wasn't a picture of faith either, as she looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. and yet they were righteous enough to be saved. 2 Peter 2, verse 7 says, "And if God rescued righteous Lot, who was greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked." Now, Sodom and Gomorrah were absolutely and utterly evil. And there's probably some parallels here between how Sodom and Gomorrah is spoken about and how Noah's world before the flood is spoken about. How in Genesis 6 it says that every intention of their heart was evil. And we get the same sort of statements about Sodom and Gomorrah being that level of evil. Interestingly, in the New Testament, there's a couple of times where it says, "For as it was in the days of Noah, so will be in the coming of the Son of Man. For they were drinking, eating, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and the flood came." The same thing is said about Sodom and Gomorrah. As it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, and then judgment came. So there's parallels between the massive judgment that God brought down with the flood, and also the judgment God brought down on Sodom and Gomorrah for the same sort of evil. Look at Genesis 19, verse 11. It just has an illustration of this evil. Look back at verse 10. The men are groping at the door, trying to get the angels. Apparently, these attractive men, the men of the city, have come to get them, to have their way with them. Verse 10, "But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door." The angels brought Lot in. Verse 11, "And the angels struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door." Now, think about this. Imagine you're endeavoring to get something. You're trying to get something, as these men were. You are struck blind. Okay? You become blind in an instant. You can't see anymore. What do you do next? Are you still concerned with what you were seeking after? You'd have to be insane. But we are told after they're struck blind that they wore themselves out groping for the door. The level of depravity and of evil inside of these men is hard to even comprehend. That they are trying to get these men, and then they are struck blind, and then they wear themselves out continuing to scratch at the door. We're talking an incredible amount of evil, the sort of evil that is talked about pre-flood. It is this kind of evil that God is coming in judgment on. Jude verse 7 says, "Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire." So he calls what happened to Sodom that them receiving eternal fire, that they received that sort of judgment of God. And then again, 2 Peter 2, that Sodom and Gomorrah are an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly. So we get here in chapter 18 a picture of judgment. Right? The first sort of tangible picture of the judgment and the wrath of God against evil and against sin, that kind of evil will not go unpunished, that God's holiness will simply not allow it. Revelation 14:10 about judgment. "He will drink the wine of God's wrath, full strength into the cup of his anger. He'll be tormented with fire and sulfur." There's a couple places in Revelation where that same sort of language is used, fire and sulfur, which is directly Sodom and Gomorrah language. So here in Genesis 18, very early, we're getting this picture of God's wrathful judgment against evil, against sin, against rebellion. A bit of a side note here, but it's really cool because it's very recent historically, is that we have pretty recently, like in the last 15 to 20 years, discovered biblical Sodom and Gomorrah. We used to think it was in one location, but it was based on something that wasn't primarily biblical. And then Christian archaeologists came back and said, it seems like the Bible would have it more in this location. And so they went and dug there, and they found these two great cities that are now accepted by all archaeologists to be Sodom and Gomorrah. And incredibly, when they dig down, like as you do, like there's layers of time, right, in the land. As they dig down, when they get to the time period that is consistent with the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, there is a layer of ash across the entire city. Black ash across the entire Sodom and Gomorrah cities and the cemeteries on the outside of the city. The whole city was burned. And in fact, it was burned in such a way that archaeologists, again, not even Christian archaeologists, go look any of this up for yourself if you don't believe me. Not even Christian archaeologists say that it was burned to a level of heat that can only be caused by something coming from outer space, like a comet or something. You can find, there's still in the cities today, that the bones of people are warped from the heat that was endured in this flash of a moment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And literally, the hypothesis of people who aren't Christians about what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, of those archaeologists, is that like a comet or asteroid came from outer space and destroyed the city. Because that's the only kind of heat that we know about that exists in the universe, is heat from that sort of thing that could do that, what it did to a city. So we have this incredible archaeological find. Also, across wherever there was water, so where the Dead Sea was at the time, throughout that location, there are balls of sulfur that those archaeologists say are the thing that caused the burning of the city. Little balls of sulfur, and they're not all over the city because when balls of sulfur hit the ground, they melt. But when they would have landed in the sea at the time, they wouldn't have melted, and so they're still there, and they are, and they're all over the place. These balls of sulfur that are credited with the burning of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, what could have happened? Who knows? It's wild. Interestingly, also, is that there have never been towns built back on those cities, which is odd. Right? There's very few ancient cities that don't have new cities built upon them. Even ones that were burned are rebuilt in the same locations later because they're in those locations for a good reason, water sources or whatever else. Those cities are never built back. There's still nothing there today, which is why we didn't know they were there. Okay, thoughts on that? We're going to do the next one's pretty quickly, I think. Thoughts on that? Yes, doctor.
Interesting fact about
Give it.
sulfur.
Yeah.
What color are the flames?
What color?
Blue.
Ah.
There's a volcano in Indonesia that burns blue.
Because of the sulfur.
Yeah.
Bet it smells delicious too. Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. All right, anything else on that Sodom and Gomorrah stuff, Lot stuff, angels, Christophanies? Any other thoughts on any of those things? Okay, Genesis 20, we can do pretty quickly. Abraham does the lying to the king about his wife thing again. Even after that went badly the first time, he does it again. God again saves Abraham's backside, and he comes to the king Abimelech in a dream and says, that's this dude's wife, and I'm going to kill you if you don't give him back. So if God wouldn't have done that, right, this is just a blip in the Genesis radar, but if God wouldn't have done that with Abimelech, Abram would have lost his wife, and the promise of Isaac would have been gone. And so God, again, takes the initiative in his own hands and solves Abraham's sinful problem, where he does the lying thing again, and God says, I've got to do it again. So he sends a dream, gets Abraham his wife back, saves the covenant, saves the promise, saves the line of Abraham and Christ to come. And on top of that, because God is a God of abundance, the king Abimelech, who took Abram's wife, then gives Abraham a bunch of wealth and makes him wealthier. So he screws it up and then ends up with even more. Genesis 21, we are introduced finally, what seems like so far the climax of at least chapter 12 and following, introduced to Isaac. Isaac has come. Sarah has been made with child, and now she is giving birth to the son of promise, the son that is impossible, the son that came in a way that doesn't make any sense, the son that came to the barren woman who was barren in her youth and too old now anyway, and yet she has become with child. Genesis 21, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who had been born to him Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And this is a large climactic moment. What's up, Lou? Right on time. Good to see you, Marley. There's this large climactic moment in Genesis here that we've been waiting for and longing for and wanting. And it's finally here. God has delivered on his promise. The first, at least loud promise he's delivered on and made it in a very clear way. There's then a tension in 21 between Isaac and Ishmael, right, the son that came by the slave woman. But Abraham still very much cares for Ishmael. Sarah gets a bit rude and jealous, as Sarah tended to do. God agrees that it's best for them to go away for the things that are to come. And Abraham and God bless Ishmael. Look at verses 20 and 21. It says, God was with the boy and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow, lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. There's a moment where it looks like they're going to struggle, but God takes care of them still. So God cares for Ishmael, despite not being the child of promise, still looking after him. Okay, Genesis 22, of course, a very significant chapter because this is the chapter where Abraham sacrifices Isaac. This chapter is seen by the New Testament as the climax of Abraham's faith. This is where Abraham's faith is at its pinnacle. This chapter, Hebrews 11:17 says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. James 2, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith was active along with his works, and his faith was made complete by his works. There's so many crimson threads here, it's hard to even talk about it, but let's look at a few. We have this, Isaac is, Isaac is one of the clearest pointers to Jesus that we have in the Old Testament, right? We have an impossible birth, right? The way it's talking about it is almost like she was conceived by the Spirit. The Lord came and did what He promised. She wasn't, but that's the way the language gives, right? It seems for us to be looking back at that and thinking of Christ's birth. Right, the birth that was impossible. Then, of course, we have the father of the nation of Israel, the nation of the people of God, with the father's sacrifice. The father of the people of God, the sacrifice. We have Isaac carrying his own altar. Look at verse 6 of 22. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and so they went both of them together. Isaac carrying his own wood, that would be his altar, and of course Jesus, John 19, he went out bearing his own cross to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. This whole Genesis 22 is a picture of what is to come with Christ. We'll talk about the morality of it in a minute. We have Isaac as the willing sacrifice. Best estimations is Isaac was in his mid-upper teens, maybe 20s. Abraham was 100. If Isaac didn't want to be sacrificed, he wouldn't have been sacrificed. I say wouldn't have been, you understand what I mean. If Isaac wasn't willing, he could have overpowered Abraham without much trouble, and yet he doesn't. Isaac carries his altar, goes to the place, sees what's happening, allows himself to be tied, and knows what is coming. And then perhaps most significantly, we have, though not maybe noticed at first, we have resurrection. Maybe even third day resurrection, by the way. We have resurrection. Here's what I mean. This moment is described in the New Testament as a test of Abraham's faith. Right? This is a test of Abraham's faith. Why? Why is it a test of Abraham's faith? In what way was Abraham showing his faith here? Right? He was showing his faith. Genesis 22, look at verse 4. It says, on the third day after he left, so God tells him to sacrifice his son. It takes him 3 days to get to where he's going. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. And Abraham said to his young man, listen to this is important. Stay with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and we will come again to you. Or and come again to you, but the pronoun is there. I and the boy will go over there to worship, and then we'll come again to you. Abraham knew what he was going to do. He knew he was going to sacrifice Isaac, and yet he still says, we will come back to you. If you want to flip there, you can, but leave a marker. Hebrews chapter 11.
Now, you know that is the first time the word worship is mentioned?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That's the very first time.
Yeah, that's good. Hebrews 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Okay, pause there. Right? So Abraham knows what God promised him. He promised him through Isaac, he would be made a great nation. Okay? And now God was calling him to sacrifice Isaac. So if he believes God's promise, then even if he sacrifices Isaac, this will not be the end of Isaac. Verse 19. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham knew he was going to sacrifice his son, but expected what was going to happen was he was going to kill his son and then God was going to raise him from the dead. Because the promise had to be fulfilled. He trusted God's promise. God had promised him that through Isaac shall your offspring be named, and now he was calling him to kill Isaac before there was any offspring. And so the only reasonable answer, if he trusted God, was that God was going to raise him from the dead. And we're told explicitly that in Hebrews. So that's what Abraham was thinking. That there was going to be a resurrection. That God would raise him. And then the third day thing is, another thing in Hebrews 11 which is interesting is it says Abraham offered Isaac, but that he did it. Right? The idea is that he accomplished it. He did offer Isaac. And of course he did. He offered him the moment they left. The moment God called him to do it, and he got his stuff together to go, he in his heart, in his mind, had already offered Isaac. So he had done it. He had offered Isaac before the action itself had taken place. And then 3 days later, he was resurrected from the dead, figuratively, Hebrews 11, but he expected it to be a real resurrection. Maybe that's relevant. Maybe it's not. What is relevant also is that Abraham was called to go to Moriah to sacrifice his son when there were lots of mountains between there and Moriah. 3 days' journey, no easy journey, up and down mountains. 3 days' journey he is called to go to Moriah. And we're never told the explicit reason for that. But we do know that Christ was crucified at least in the mountain range of Moriah. Some will go as far to say it was the same mountain. We don't know that for sure. But it was certainly the same area as the place Christ was crucified. And so Abraham goes to the place, the mountain range, the area where Christ was crucified, as the father of the people of God, offers his son as a willing sacrifice, knowing that God is going to raise him from the dead, to be the founder of the people of God, to be the one through whom God would fulfill his promises. Goodness gracious. I could say the same things about the cross. Right, at the cross, that God the Father brings the Son on this long journey from heaven to earth to go to the cross, the place where the Father would offer the willing Son, and the willing Son would then be resurrected and become the progenitor of the entire people of God. It is the whole story of the gospel in Genesis 22, given to us very early. Verse 8 of 22. Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they both went, both of them together. Look down at verse 14. Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And we now know that on the same range of mountains, the Lord provided the ultimate lamb to be sacrificed. In John chapter 8, Jesus said, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. That Abraham saw the day of Christ, and he got a glimpse of it maybe most clearly on that mountain. Okay, so here was Abraham's life. God says, go, get out of your land, your home, I'm sending you out. Abraham says, where? And God says, I'll tell you later, just go. And God says, I'm going to give you a land. And Abraham says, where? And God says, I'll tell you later, just wander. And God says, I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham says, how? And he says, I'll tell you later, just wait. And God says, take your son and kill him. And Abraham says, why? And God said, I'll tell you later, walk up the mountain and do it. Abram lived a life of faith. Not of perfection, made a lot of mistakes. But he lived a life of trusting God. Not always, but the pattern of his life was trusting God. Where he took missteps and lied and went back to his old ways of sin, which we all tend to do. His pattern of life was aimed at trusting in Christ, believing in Christ.